Ladies and gentlemen, dear guests, hello from the German house in New York City, and welcome to Urban Spaces and German Traces, Immigration and Jewish Life in the United States. I am Eva Bosbach, Executive Director of the University of Cologne's New York office, and it is my great pleasure to welcome you all to our fourth Transatlantic Tandem Talk, part of a series held on the occasion of the 10th anniversary of the North America office of the University of Cologne this year. We host the series in cooperation with our partners, the German Center for Research and Innovation, DWIH New York, the German Consulate General New York, the German Academic Exchange Service, DAAD New York, Deutsches Haus at NYU, the Goethe Institute New York, the German Embassy Washington DC, Amerika Haus Nordrhein-Westfalen, Wunderbar Together, the German Research Foundation, DFG North America, and of course, denn, Space for Ideas, who is our close partner for this Transatlantic Tandem Talk, as it is also part of their denn Past and Future Festival. I would like to give a special welcome to our speakers today, Anke Ortlepp, Professor of North American History at the University of Cologne in Germany, and Lila Corwin Berman, Professor of History and Director of the Feinstein Center for American Jewish History at Temple University in Philadelphia. Thank you so much for being with us across the Atlantic today. And we are looking forward to hearing your insights into how immigration and Jewish life shaped our landscape in the United States. It is now my pleasure to give the floor to the Executive Director of denn Space for Ideas, Dr. Katja Wiesbach-Donovan, who is the moderator of today's talk. Thank you, Katja, and enjoy the discussion.
Thank you so much, Eva, and good morning to everyone in the United States, and good afternoon to those viewers who are dialing in from Europe. Very happy to partner with the University of Cologne for its Transatlantic Tandem Talks. And thank you so much, Eva, for organizing this particular virtual talk. denn is a nonprofit organization that takes up global topics and discusses them from a transatlantic perspective. So I'm very much looking forward to today's conversation about immigration and Jewish life in the United States with Anke and Lila, two distinguished scholars from both sides of the Atlantic. What does immigration mean for the respective culture and language? Where do immigrants settle, and how do they maintain their identity through institutions and philanthropy? Specifically, is there still German life in New York City? And what does Jewish urban history look like? But before we dive into the conversation, I would like to encourage our audience to ask questions throughout the entire talk by using the chat function. And we will do our best to fold them into this conversation. So Anke, let's start, perhaps with you. Could you set the stage for us by sharing your research on German European immigration to the United States? What was the motivation and perhaps also the expectation for Europeans to migrate to the United States at different points in history?
I'd be very happy to, Katja. I think we can look at European immigration to the United States within what I identified as 5 different time frames. And during those different times, people migrated and immigrated to the United States for different reasons. They got pushed out of their home countries for different reasons and were pulled to the United States for various reasons. And I think maybe we could start with the colonial period. And I just, very broadly would look at the period from the establishment of the first colonies to American independence and point out that during that period, people mostly came from Great Britain and Northern Germany to the United States, among them many religious dissenters, like the Puritans, the Amish, but also, it brought many West Africans to the United States in patterns of forced migration. And if these people settled in the 13 colonies, many of which, in particular, Pennsylvania, where Lila now lives, invited immigrants, offered resources, and very importantly, religious freedoms. And then if we turn to the 19th century, the first half of the 19th century, millions of migrants continued to arrive, also from West Africa. And they included big groups of Irish following the potato famine, and also Germans after the revolution of 1848 and 49 as political refugees. And then if we wanted to look at the turn of the century period from the 19th to the 20th, I think it's mostly processes of urbanization and industrialization that draw people to the United States. Their desire to have a better life in a country that promises opportunity, and the millions of people who arrived, and it's really double-digit millions of people. They came from Northern and Central European countries, but they also started to include people from Southeastern Europe and Russia. And I'm sure Lila will talk more about that, who fled religious and political persecution. And the first patterns of restriction begin to appear. Think about the Chinese Exclusion Act. Immigrants from Asia were not welcome during this period. And we see more of that in the first half of the 20th century, when strict immigration laws like the 1924 Act kick in, keep people out, and they continue to welcome immigrants from Central and Northern Europe. And then I think if we look at the second half of the 20th century, the backgrounds of immigrants become more diverse. They include refugees, say from Southeast Asia after the end of the Vietnam War, or from Central America, Guatemala, Nicaragua, and increasingly, we see migration patterns from different countries in Africa, Latin America, and from across the world. So I think probably in the second half of the 20th century, the backgrounds of immigrants become increasingly diverse, and interestingly, the numbers of Germans who migrate to the United States steeply decline.
Thank you so much, Anke. That's very interesting to see this development, and also see European immigration sort of going back in numbers as other immigration sort of picked up in the second half of the 20th century. And Lila, let's perhaps focus on one specific immigrant group, which is the Jewish people. So you're an expert on Jewish urban history in the 20th century. Could you share some of your expertise with us?
Yeah, it's interesting, Anke, as you were giving that overview, which I think is a really good overview. I was thinking that, historians of American Jews really talk about those same kinds of periods and try to sort of slot in the waves of Jewish immigration into those kinds of periods, right? So you have this kind of colonial period when a very, very small number of Jews come to the Americas. Often they're not coming for permanent settlement. Often Jews were coming as part of kinds of trade networks and trade relationships. They were moving through kind of the imperial system of that period, especially Jews who had ties to the Spanish Empire. And then there's this period right after the independence of the United States and kind of the early republic. And that's the period. So roughly, especially kind of starting in the early 19th century, but moving up almost through the full 19th century, except the very end, when American Jewish historians have talked about the German Jewish wave of immigration to the United States, right? And there's always been this real imprecision about that period, right? I mean, one problem is that it's kind of chronologically really fuzzy because there really aren't very many German Jews who come over to the United States until later in the 19th century. I think especially in the 1840s when there was economic depression, there's a bump of the numbers that come over. But it's really Jews who are coming from lots of places in Europe that kind of get bundled together as being German Jews. You know more than I really that what Germany is even in that period is really unclear. There's a lot of shifting of boundaries and, ideas of what Germanness is. And so there's a way, and I'd be interested actually to hear your thoughts about this, like there's a way in which for Jews coming over to the United States in that period somehow concretizes their Germanness, even in, the quote unquote old world, that might not have been exactly how they were identifying. Some would have, absolutely. Some would have really said that they were German and they bring that self-consciousness with them. And others would not have sort of brought that sense. So I'm curious and if it's okay just to like open it up with a question for you, I'm curious when you think specifically about that period, which is when the bulk of like Germans come to the United States, what was the kind of consciousness of Germanness that people had, and to what extent is it kind of constructed in the United States?
Mm-hmm. That's a very interesting question, Lila. And just to come back about the Germanness of the Jews who come, I think, sort of the early 19th century is the period when, in particular, in some of the German states, Jews get emancipated, they get more political rights, and they get, for the first time, the opportunity to really identify with the political units that grants them not quite, but almost citizenship rights. And so they become members of the bourgeoisie. And in places like Berlin, a number of well-connected Jewish women have salons, and they invite people to join them for literature readings. And so the people the Jews who emigrate to the United States bring that consciousness with them that Germany or the German states, some of the German states, have become places of opportunity. And that, shifts over the course of the 19th century. And to answer, your broader question is like, what is Germanness in an American background? And, one has to say that the Germans were such a heterogeneous community from so many, if not language, dialect backgrounds, regional backgrounds, political backgrounds, that it was really their cultural practices that define them as a group, their ways of organizing into associations, and Vereine is the German word for that, and the common language that they spoke. I mean, sort of High German, even sort of in the 19th century, was something that sort of provided some form of linguistic unity, and it was little else, not really their class backgrounds, not really their religious backgrounds. And so, to get together and literally have a beer and have a good time, and organize around a common, maybe leisure activity or a political interest, was what made Germans become German Americans in the United States.
It's interesting if I can respond to that, because I think all of that is quite true for German Jews in the United States as well, mm-hmm. right? That kind of dynamic you just explained. And then kind of moving forward with your paradigm of these different ways of immigration, in the late 19th century, when there's like a massive influx of Jews to the United States, but not from German-speaking areas, but mm-hmm. from Eastern European areas, Jews' Germanness, those Jews who identify as being German, I think their Germanness becomes heightened as a response to all of these new Jewish populations who are coming in, who are, yes, Jewish, but they're different in a certain way, right? And so I think that, there's a way in which the kind of significance and meaning of Germanness then becomes sort of heightened for these Jews when they're kind of engaged in this pursuit of, like, to what extent are they identifying with these new Jewish immigrants that are coming in, and to what extent do they want to keep their distance? Because, as you mentioned, right, at the end of the 19th century is when these kinds of restrictionist and nativist ideas in the United States gain a lot more, kind of power and popular energy behind them. And so, and that is really responding, yes, first there's the Chinese Exclusion Act, and then it's also a response to all of the new Southern and Eastern European immigrants, among whom are Jews, who are coming in. So Germanness always kind of being fashioned and constructed in new ways through language, through, for Jews, a kind of affiliation with a particular kind of strain of Judaism, right? A very Enlightenment inflected, called Reform kind of Judaism, right? Certainly through the kinds of clubs and the social associations that they're creating and that they're part of. It's a way of having some kind of remove from those new Jews who are coming in.
Yeah, I totally agree. And that's so interesting that, initially we could say people bonded over ethnicity. The German Jews did, and they, I'm most familiar with Milwaukee in Wisconsin, and there, the German Jews were very hostile when newcomers from Poland and other Southeastern European places came in, and they refused them membership in the synagogues and excluded them from other ways of participating, sort of in Jewish circles. And it's interesting that I would say in the later 19th century and in the beginning of the 20th century, people bond more over class as members of working class organizations or labor unions and members, sort of the industrial working class. And if you look through the membership lists of some of the political clubs and the labor organizations, we see Jews and Gentiles from different backgrounds, Germans, and non-Germans, get together once again, but in a completely different way that was kind of disconnected from their religious backgrounds to fight for collective bargaining rights, and more inclusive political participation.
Thank you so much. And I think it's so interesting what you said about, cultural heritage language that actually presides over class, over, over your geographical background and where in all the different German states you're actually coming from. Maybe we focus on language just for a second. And of course, in New York, there are more than 600 languages are being spoken in the New York metropolitan area, which of course cannot be more than a demonstration of how diverse the area is here. What I would like to know from you is, these different immigration groups, are there differences, from people coming from Europe and how they cherish their own language and culture? Are there different attitudes towards assimilation and preserving culture and language? And has that changed over time?
Do you want me to go ahead and address that? I think, for Germans, language was really important because, as I mentioned earlier, it was one of the few things that really lent a group identity. So many other things were so different that German bonded over the importance of bringing their language to the community and founding schools and normal schools and other educational facilities where German was taught. And I think, the German language and issues of alcohol and consumption and prohibition became, two of the most important issues for the German community in the 19th and the 20th century. And I think that's probably a little bit different from some of the other European ethnic groups. One could look at the Italians, the Poles, people from different Scandinavian countries. I would, think that there is a slight difference, even though, many first generation immigrants spoke their languages at home, and it was their kids and grandchildren, who then used English more. And I think with the German Jews, Yiddish, of course, was an important means of communication, right? More so often than what we would, call High German or a regional dialect.
Yeah, but it's also interesting because I think that's certainly the case, right? I mean, that was the language that many Jews who were living in German states were speaking at home, were speaking with one another. But there's also a kind of elite echelon of German Jews who come to the United States who feel like there is a kind of cultural power to German, and who, feel like it's a way of kind of announcing that Jews are fully embracing the ideas of the Enlightenment, that they're not using their own dialects, that they're not kind of maintaining this sense of being a subgroup or even a separate group, but they're really fully emancipating as individuals. And the language of that had been German. Moses Mendelssohn and other German Jewish Enlightenment thinkers is really, in part an announcement that like we can be structured to the very way that we think and express ourselves by the nations in which we live, and that is the basic Enlightenment ideal. And so I think that there were some elite German Jews who come over to the United States and became kind of leaders of the community who'd been educated in that, and who kind of hold on to Germanness as being high culture, as being the kind of language of real education and of embracing those Enlightenment ideals. So there are, for example, German Jewish newspapers that are started. There are also Yiddish newspapers that are started, but there are ones that are written specifically in German for Jews in the United States. There are prayer books that are, maintained in German that are used in the United States as well. I don't think that this ends up being a really enduring piece of American Jewish identity, but it's sometimes interesting to think of the history of those things that don't end up being sustained, right? But it is not the case that, for example, when Jews came over in the late 19th century from Poland, that they held on to Polish like that. I can think of almost no examples of that. And Russian, perhaps there were a few radical pockets of Jews that would have seen Russian as sort of the language of revolution, and might have kind of held on to it, but much less so. I mean, there was a sort of pronounced idea of Germanness potentially sort of being this way that Jews were, announcing their kind of emancipation, their ability to live out the ideals of the Enlightenment.
Yeah, that's good. Could I add one little thingy here? What I thought was really interesting in the German community are gender differences in language use. The German club women that I studied held on to the German language much longer than their male peers did in their organization, and even, sort of past that traumatic watershed moment of World War II, when many organizations felt, they were forced to switch to English to declare their loyalty to the United States. And, in the sources, the war in women's organizations, the war doesn't even happen. If you just read women's sources, there wouldn't be, the Great War, and women continued to use German for their meetings and their minutes. And probably also, as the language they spoke at home. And so language is hugely important for the German community. And let me just step away for a second, turn the lights on here. It's starting to get dark in Germany.
Absolutely. No, I think that's super interesting, sort of to also see the difference between trying to maintain German versus maintaining Polish, Russian, other languages spoken in Eastern Europe. What I'm interested in, if we flip it around and say the appreciation in the United States for diversity and for, preserving cultural heritages of, the people coming into the United States, bilingual education. Has that changed in your opinion? And what does that do sort of to, for these immigrant groups to, foster their cultural identity or preserve their languages?
So I think, there weren't a lot of fans of bilingual education in German and English in the 19th century among educators in the United States. German was seen as a language that separated Germans from the cultural mainstream. And so eventually, in many states and many cities where huge German populations lived, schools and the community was sort of forced to give it up. And that created, of course, hostility in the German community. But I think what had a lasting impact on educational landscapes in the United States were, sort of how we organize pre-K-12 education in our universities. And so German as a language is not so important there, but the way that the school system is organized, and especially institutions of higher education, the German model was hugely important for that, starting with Johns Hopkins University and many other examples. And I think now there's probably a returning interest in language diversity. I know it's a hot sort of topic in many states with huge Latinx populations. And it's, that's often a difficult topic for both communities of migrants, and the state governments or the municipal governments where they reside.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting, the framing of the question, because I think for different groups of Jews who came over to the United States, especially, in the mid to late 19th century and even into the early 20th century, it wasn't necessarily clear that there was a respect for linguistic diversity, and in fact, I think that the idea of language was very often, a really vexed, difficult kind of concept that made people feel uncertain, made people feel ambivalent, made people feel uncomfortable sort of venturing out beyond, maybe the very specific geography of their neighborhood, right? I mean, I think that there was, especially with the kind of rise of immigration restriction and nativism, a real sense that if you were going to be an American, you were going to speak English. And, that it was really very, very important that transformation happen. Even that doesn't mean that there weren't really live and important linguistic subcultures among ethnic groups, absolutely. But I think there was also a lot of pressure. And then an interesting piece of this for Jews is, as they start to think in a more proactive way, what kinds of language preservation efforts are important for kind of keeping some sense of a Jewish community. It's not clear even what language that's supposed to be, right? I mean, there are Yiddish schools that start, right, that children, should learn Yiddish, and of course they're going to be speaking English in the public school, and that, different Jewish immigrant groups feel like it's really important, if the children are going to maintain some sense of who they are, that they learn Yiddish. But there's, of course, then this other kind of movement that they should learn Hebrew, right? Which is an entirely different kind of political movement, in a sense, because it's really thinking about Zionism and the kind of rising ideas of Jewish nationalism and territorial nationalism. And in fact, in the early 20th century, there are some efforts to, this is, I think, in the 1920s, 1930s, to get certain American public schools to teach Hebrew, which some did start to teach Hebrew as one of the languages. It generally had been German, French were the languages that American public schools would teach, other than English. And there's efforts to set up schools where kids will learn Hebrew, not just as an ancient or kind of textual language, but also as a living language. So it's not totally clear even what the language is supposed to be. And then it's not clear if America is really so accepting necessarily of people who hold on to different languages.
We have one viewer question, and it goes a little bit back to, what languages are brought to the United States and how you preserve it. But speaking about Yiddish, so the viewer asked, he thinks, the Jews coming from Poland, they spoke rather Yiddish than the Jews coming from Germany. So, is it natural that Jewish people coming from Germany would rather maintain the High German, the German royal Jews coming from Poland, were different in that sense?
So it's definitely the case that there were like Jewish communities in Germany that really primarily would have spoken German. And so then, yes, that would have been natural that German would have been the language that they spoke. But there were plenty of Jewish communities in Germany and in the German states where Yiddish would have been the primary language that was spoken at home, and that was spoken also, among the Jewish subgroups that they would have had relationships with. So it's not necessarily totally clear cut. And then just to add more wrinkles to it, there were different dialects of Yiddish, right? So there were forms of Yiddish that were much more Germanized and, much more what you're calling sort of High German. There were forms of Yiddish that had many more sort of Slavic and Russian inflections. So there was sort of a mishmash of what that kind of Jewish dialect would have been.
It also, to some extent, explains why Polish wasn't kept as much as German did, because a lot of people coming from Poland spoke Yiddish rather than Polish.
Right. Although many Jews who lived in places that were part of Poland, again, another difficult sort of geography to parse, many of them would have had some familiarity with Polish, right? Depending on what their, professions were and where they lived and whatever else. So those language lines were complicated, but right. I mean, there are many reasons that it makes sense that Jews coming over to the United States wouldn't have been sort of speaking or holding on to Polish, and they would have more so been doing that with German.
Lila, I'm just switching a little bit here, but I know that your new research explores the intersection of American citizenship law, liberalism, and Jewishness. And could you tell us a little bit about if and how the Jewish community, what role does citizenship play in this whole idea of preserving language and culture?
Yeah, so, obviously one of the major forces that is, kind of in the background of everything we're talking about, right, and we've all mentioned, is the idea of emancipation, the idea that people as individuals should gain political and civil rights, as opposed to those rights being conferred upon groups of people by their status in the group. When Jews came to the United States, according to the kinds of statutes and laws governing American citizenship, Jews had access to citizenship, because if they came before the Civil War, the governing statute was that all free white people, which meant men really, could gain the full rights of political and civil citizenship. And if they came after the Civil War, there was an addition to that if somebody was of African nativity or African ancestry, they also could. So on one hand, the kind of reigning interpretation is that when Jews came to the United States, they were more or less emancipated upon arrival, right? They gained these full kinds of rights as citizens. And what I've been really interested in exploring in my research is how does the sort of process of emancipation that Jewish historians are so interested in talking about in Europe, because it's just very obviously a process, right? I mean, the French Revolution happens, and before too long, Napoleon is calling the Jews of France up to ask them, like, now, really, can you be citizens? Would you fight alongside a French person? Would you shoot a Jewish person if you were fighting against a French person? And I mean, literally, these are the questions that Napoleon poses to Jews, and they have to sort of answer and say how they think they could be appropriate citizens. So in the kind of research I'm doing, I've been interested in how Jews in the United States are thinking about citizenship and to what extent they are able to take advantage of the full rights and privileges of citizenship in the United States. And I think it's very much the case that all of the kinds of exclusions and limitations that are in fact written into the idea of liberal citizenship, right? That the neutral individual is assumed in many ways in the United States, not only to be male, not only to be white, but also to be Christian. Mm-hmm. And there are clear ways in which, even if one has papers and is a citizen, there are, in a sense, all of these kind of conditioned ways or semi-partial ways that Jews experience citizenship in the United States. And so, I think it's probably a much more complicated story than Jews just coming here and immediately feeling like, done deal, they're citizens. And I think that fact accounts for a lot of the different forms of communal organizing, a lot of the intra-communal tension and debate about how to be an American, how to display one's Americanness, because I think there is a sort of persistent sense that Jews might kind of be on a thin edge of possibly being excluded, and immigration restriction debates in part are hinging on the fact that a lot of American policymakers and politicians are not comfortable with the fact that Jews, among other new immigrant groups, are coming and changing what they would call the racial stock of the United States.
Do you want to comment on that quickly, or?
Yeah, and I mean, that differentiates, also the German Jews from many of the other Germans that came to the United States who did not really have to fight for their citizenship rights, at least not in the 19th century, except for the women, of course, right? Because citizenship laws didn't apply to women. Women were not considered to be citizens. And what's also interesting is that, Germans didn't really have to fight for citizenship rights because from the beginning, really, they were considered to be white. Whereas Italians, the Irish, and some Southern Europeans had to, sort of claim whiteness and become conceptualized as whites, in particular after the end of the Civil War and during the Reconstruction period. That was never really the case for Germans, even though, sort of not all of them arrived as free people in the United States, but as indentured servants who were in indentured servitude, that, sort of other form of unfree labor in the United States for a number of years to, pay for their passage to the US. And, some had not been free, but Leibeigene in Germany before they came. But, sort of, I guess for the majority of the Germans, sort of they arrive in the United States, it's easy for them to become naturalized. Their citizenship is not really contested until World War I. When the question is, so, hey, where do you belong? You still speak German. Are you a US citizen, or do you want to go back to the Kaiser and, to go back to Germany and fight for the Kaiser? That was the big question. And then, of course, the majority of them said, well, we stop calling our cabbage sauerkraut and we'll be Americans.
Yeah, I think the question of where do you belong and, the stereotypes that go with it, that leads us to another set of questions revolving around institutions and settlement. So, I think where immigrants settle and how they organize their lives, through their own cultural institutions, houses of worship, other means, that seems to be critical in preserving, cultural values and traditions. And so, Anke, let's start with you, perhaps. So, United States is often described, for years and years as a melting pot or a salad bowl or a chili bowl that alludes to different ways of assimilating or integrating. You wrote about German American Women's Club in Milwaukee from 1844 to 1914. And this study considers the full range of German American women's organizations, and it analyzes not only their significance as sites of feminist development, but also reproduction of ethnic identity. So how do you look at these metaphors that I mentioned? For a heterogeneous society becoming more or less homogeneous, from studies of these women's groups?
Yeah, for the Germans, that can be a complicated question because, they were big and diverse communities. And yet we could say, that these days German culture seems to have disappeared into the American mainstream, or we could say so much about American culture is really German. Some of the food that Americans like, some of the words that they use, Angst, Zeitgeist, Kindergarten, there is a whole list of them, the educational institutions, many other things. And, it's interesting that the women that I always, say my women, so the women that I studied, for a long time, interestingly, lived in a German bubble, but they were only able to do so because the German community in Milwaukee was so big. And one could say similar things about the German communities, of Cincinnati, of New York, of all the places, Chicago, of course, Indianapolis, that had big German American communities. And I don't really like to speak about assimilation because that always, kind of assumes that there's something like a dominant culture and those who come have to somehow figure out how to deal with that and then kind of, imitate that and become Americans. I think I like the word acculturation much more, which suggests a give and take between, the dominant culture. That's the word that we use in migration history, and those who join that culture. And it's a give and take, and some, cultural practices disappear, some get accepted by others. And I think German women are important interlocutors because, they serve an important function in teaching their kids German culture, but they also recognize, that the German bubble will not exist forever, that German kids are more interested in American sports, that they sometimes get tired of German food, and that they like to interact with members of other ethnic groups. And it's often the sports clubs that serve as important, sort of locations for intercultural communication and exchange. And so, it's a complicated picture, but it also tells us, how dynamic a society, American society was at the end of the 19th century, with all its forms also of discrimination, and forms of acceptance it offered to newcomers. And Germans were part of that. So they welcomed, they discriminated against people. But, as sort of the biggest immigration group, it's interesting, that it's Germanness these days is everywhere and nowhere. It's not as visible anymore as, let's say, sort of little Italies or Chinatowns in different American cities.
Yeah.
And New York is an interesting example that we'll talk more about.
That's right. I have one viewer question before we go to Lila and maybe talk about philanthropy as another means of holding together a community. So the viewer asked, what is America other than the sum of its parts? So Anke, it's...
Yeah, that's what it is. Yeah, but I think, sometimes, and the melting pot and the salad bowl or the pizza, they're all, sort of, they're great metaphors. And I think, sort of, immigration and acculturation is all of that, and it's different things in different places across sort of the different decades and centuries. And even if one ethnic group separates itself from others for a while, there's only certain of it takes maybe sort of a generation to overcome that. And so I would say it's neither one nor the other. It's so many different things at the same time, and it's a constant exchange sort of cultural practices.
Right. Lila, let's turn to you. So in your recent book, The American Jewish Philanthropic Complex, The History of a Multi-Billion-Dollar Institution, you explain how the obligation to provide for the less fortunate of the community, a signal ethical value of Jewish life, and the basis for Jewish philanthropic organizations and institutions, represents a thread of unity and continuity with tradition and cultural values. But your research also shows that it has evolved within the American society, somewhat away from wealth distribution towards capital accumulation. Can you elaborate a little bit on this? And what does this mean for preserving Jewish culture in a foreign country or society? In a system perhaps that predominantly defies socialism and embraces capitalism? How does that all go together?
Yeah, Anke, while you were talking, I was thinking about how the Jews who came over from Germany were really the ones who established like the kind of central organs of Jewish communal life in the United States, right? They were like really institution builders. And maybe like for another time, it'd be really interesting to kind of think about like, you know, to what extent is there something about that German background and the idea of building institutions that was really important. I know from the American context, it happens that when those German Jews are sort of coming of age, when some of them have really, you know, gained some wealth, some power, and they're, you know, in a position to think about institution building, it's also the case that it's a period in American history when there's like a massive explosion of associations that are being built in the United States, benevolent associations, fraternal organizations, mutual aid societies, all sorts of kinds of organizations, defense organizations, all sorts of things. So I've always thought that a lot of the energy for kind of building these big institutions, starting in the 1840s, when really the first kind of broad Jewish communal organization called B'nai B'rith is founded by 12 German Jews on Essex Street in New York City. You know, that energy of these German Jews was really responding to the American environment, which was in this sort of like frenzy of all of these different kind of non-governmental organizations being founded. But it's interesting to think about what kind of German consciousness they might have also been bringing with them to build these organizations. And it's really, you know, it's absolutely the case that these kinds of organizations that are meant to sort of provision for Jewish communities and also to kind of structure and organize Jewish communities, they're really led, not only established, but really led by Jews who call themselves or would have, you know, been understood as German Jews well into the 20th century. So in New York City, a really important Jewish umbrella charitable organization called the Federation System starts in 1917. At that point, the population of New York City is much more heavily Eastern European Jews than so-called German Jews. But if you look at the board, if you look at who is sitting at the center of that federated charitable Jewish structure, it was all German Jews, right? People, and a very, very elite group of them who had money and who, you know, were able to kind of put together this kind of organization. And so there's this, you know, in my research on Jewish philanthropy, one of the arguments I make is that it serves multiple purposes. And one purpose of it is certainly kind of internal to provision for and organize Jewish life in the United States, but it's also about being kind of legible and understandable in the American landscape, where there really are this, you know, there is this kind of expectation of lots of different groupings and associations that people can be part of, and that, you know, there's a kind of sense that this is how group life will be organized in the United States. It's not a political identity, but nonetheless, it's a way of kind of communities organizing themselves. And I kind of trace the shifting kind of technologies, financial technologies that organize Jewish philanthropy, and I think other kind of American philanthropy more generally, you know, which had initially been really about distributing, you know, kind of fundraising power and capital to those who are in need at various moments. But certainly in Jewish life, the kind of money comes to symbolize something beyond what it might actually be able to achieve in any immediate sense. And it symbolizes the kind of stability of the community, right? That it's able to kind of have this capital, and you know, Jewish organizations had never really built endowments, for example, in the United States until the 1960s and 1970s, when there's a shift to think that, you know, it's not just the structure of the institution or the organization, it's not just provisioning for needs. As Jews become more middle and upper middle class, those needs shift, but it's also about kind of some sense that in the United States, part of what allows you to imagine a stable future is the ability for you to grow your corpus, to grow the kind of financial strength that you have. And this is as much the case in Jewish life as it is in all sorts of other places in American life. It's not just a Jewish pattern.
Right. Thank you so much. So before we spend the last few minutes on New York, which is so interesting in itself, I have two viewer questions. One viewer asked, in your research, have you found any places of intersection between German Americans and German Jewish Americans? So are there spaces, institutions where they actually meet? And another viewer asked, how much friction developed between immigrant Jews from Germany and those from Eastern Europe? So this is very hard to answer in 1 minute.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, I mean, there were many places where German immigrants and, sort of German Gentiles and German Jews met, sort of not necessarily, of course, in their houses of worship, but in, educational institutions, in reading clubs, in, Lila just mentioned them, all the mutual aid organizations, the fraternal organizations, and they had lots of common ground, or they would, run a charitable institution together. Sort of Milwaukee had a big settlement house that was run by Liz Kander, a German Jewish director, and sort of she went on fundraising sprees through the German community and published a cookbook that helped her raise money, and that was one of the many venues. And we could look at New York and see similar activities where sort of German Jews and people who were not Jews collaborated. And sort of subscribed to common activities.
And I'll just very briefly say a word about the friction. There certainly was friction. And there was also ways that big debates within Jewish life and sort of beyond Jewish life in the United States were sort of organized on those lines. So even if it was sort of an overstated kind of friction, it became almost like a stereotype. Oh, if you're a kind of German Jew, this is who you are, and this is what you think about things, and you're more conservative, and you're more this and that and the other thing. And if you're an Eastern European Jew or a Yiddish kind of from Russia, from Poland Jew, you're all these other things. So it came to sort of characterize something beyond what on the ground was necessarily happening. But one place where there is certainly tension is in the kind of efforts to organize Jewish communities. And you see it in New York City when, I just mentioned these kind of elite German Jewish men primarily who are at the helm of these large charitable organizations. And then you have folks from Eastern European Jewish backgrounds who are saying, those aren't speaking to our concerns. And this is not how we want to do things. And there's eventually an effort to create something called an American Jewish Congress that was meant to kind of take the American ethos of democracy and say every group, every ideology needs to have a voice. But even there, you see some of the German Jews who happen to also have money, right? So there's a particular power with that as sort of agenda-setting power. You see them sort of taking a heavier hand sometimes with organizing things. So there was tension, and then there was also sort of the larger imagery of that tension.
Yeah, thank you. So let's spend our last 5 minutes on New York. New York, the Jewish population in New York makes 13% of the entire population, and making it the Jewish community largest in the world outside of Israel, of course. And if you look, if you walk through New York, there are all kinds of German traces, German meat stores, churches, cultural institutions, museums, bars. So you find a lot of Jewish life, of course, naturally, and German life in New York City. Can you just give us a little bit of your sense of what the city is about, and maybe also from the sense of urban history, urban development? Is New York unique in that sense, or are there other larger cities where you have a similar situation?
I think, New York is so important, and it's so different in many ways because, of course, in the 19th century and for most of the 20th, I'm not sure, is it still the biggest city in the United States? It probably is. And it, was the entry point for so many Germans and German Jews to the United States. And some stayed, and tapped into networks of family and friends and regional connections, and others moved on to, move to Midwestern cities or start a farm somewhere in the Midwest. And it's, sort of, I think, the institution building that Lila described had a long-term effect. And I think that's why we still see some of the German organizations that were founded in the 19th century alive and kicking these days, even though some have aged over the years. Their members have grown older. They have trouble recruiting younger German Americans, but they're still there. And then I think then there is sort of German nostalgia, right, for German foods and German beers. Every time I go to New York, I go to the Lorelei on the Lower East Side and have a Kölsch, so the beer that we drink here in Cologne. And there seems to be sort of, a known and maybe also a newfound appreciation for some forms of German culture. And I think that's why New York is important, because, its German community was huge, and it included Germans of so many different backgrounds, and it still does. They just bring more recent immigration histories and sort of issues that are of concern to a contemporary generation of German Americans.
So many of those things, Anke, you just said about kind of the place of New York for Germanness and for German Americans, I think would hold true for Jews as well. I mean, New York is this city that lends itself to just this constant reinvention as being a place of a certain kind of nostalgia, right? So we're not a very old country here, right? Like our nostalgia is all very new. But New York, it is sort of the center for the ways, it's less Plymouth Rock maybe that now, an immigrant group would say, this proves that I have this sort of depth of history in the United States. It's New York, right? It's maybe Ellis Island, but even more so, it's like what neighborhood in New York and what bar or cafe or deli, you can go to and say, see, this proves something about kind of our place in this city. And it's always been fascinating to me that as early as like the 19-teens, 1920s, Jews in New York City, some of these same elite German Jews, start the act of kind of creating New York historical societies and New York historical sort of home museums. Like, again, this in the scheme of things, like New York as a big bustling city is so new then, right? Like, why create this sort of historical society? But like being on the leading edge of designating the kind of importance and the value of New York as a kind of cradle of a new kind of American history. And how certain Jews became so invested in, and this is not creating Jewish historical societies. This is just New York City kind of history interest and museums and whatever. So like being really interested in naming New York as a kind of center, a different kind of cultural center of Americanness. And I think that a lot of what you just said about kind of what New York is and what it represents is the reason that there's the interest in designating it that way.
Anke and Lila, thank you so much for this super fascinating conversation. And we have a lot more viewer questions. I would love to go on, but we've come to the end of our discussion. Also, on behalf of Eva from the University Liaison Office Cologne here in New York, I would just like to thank you so much. I'd love to meet you in person and continue this discussion in person in New York. I would like to thank the viewers for tuning in. I would like to invite everybody to come to the 1014 exhibition this weekend, Thursday to Sunday, where we display the past and future of our building 1014, but also shed some light on immigration history in the Upper East Side in New York. So if you're interested in this topic, please come and join us for this exhibition at 1014, Thursday to Friday. And again, thank you to Lila, thank you to Anke for this very fascinating discussion. Truly appreciate it. And thank you to the viewers, and have a wonderful